Greetings, everybody. My name is Djene Bajalan, and welcome to This is Revolution. And we have a very special pre-record for you today. Unfortunately, Jason cannot be with us, so I am stepping in to help run the show. But of course, we have a wonderful set of co-hosts today for today's show, including, well, he may not be my homie, he may not be my dog, but he is my very dear friend, Mr. Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings, Djene Bajalan, and to the audience as well.
And of course, joining us all the way from Wales, we have our friend Stefan Bertramley.
The music's a lot harder in the pre-record intros.
It was very hard today. I think Jason may have changed the volumes up on the music.
Let's go.
So today we are going to be talking about the UK Labour Party, and we're specifically going to be talking with James Smith, who is the author of Other People's Politics, Populism to Corbynism, and Work, Want, Work, which is another interesting book that I think people should check out. And he's also the co-host of the Popular Show, and he recently wrote an interesting piece in the Jacobin about the failures of Britain's Labour Party and, you know, what happened, why it got smashed in 2019. And of course, alongside him is his co-host of the Popular Show, Mr. David Slavick, who is a very old friend. He worked with me back in the early days of TMBS as a producer. He is now a super dad, living, you know, he's escaped America and lives in beautiful, I don't know, sunny Canada or something like that. So, David Slavick, welcome. Can you hear us?
I can.
I don't know about David. He's
not. Is he moving? Oh, he blinked.
Is he moving? He is on the screen. Can you hear us, David?
Yeah, there you are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is an old like alpha move.
Yeah, he was just
alpha move. Just pretend you can't hear and just sort of sit there while everyone stares into you.
Absorb my energies.
Exactly. So, your article, James, was very interesting in the Jacobin, in your kind of highlighting the failures of labor. And I think, you know, some of the points you made were not quite the points about labor's failures that are generally being looked at on the political left. So would you like to begin perhaps by saying, you know, what inspired you to write this article and what your central thesis was? And I will get off the screen.
Well, I was inspired really by a sense of despondency, not at the defeat of Corbyn in 2019, although of course that was an important moment in my life, and I'm sure that's true of a lot of people in Britain. But as I wrote in the Independent newspaper a week after the election, that wasn't the defeat of the left, because okay, Corbyn and those of us who supported him were humiliated, but so too were the political assumptions of our centrist, right-wing liberal rivals within the Labour Party. They got it wrong too. They believed that a centrist third party would be important electorally. They believed that there'd be a regeneration of the Liberal Democrats. They believed that backing a second referendum to undo Brexit would be electorally popular. All of that was humiliated and discredited as much, if not more, than the socialist policies of Jeremy Corbyn were. The real defeat happened after that, and it was when Sir Keir Starmer won the Labour leadership, overwhelmingly trouncing Corbyn's chosen successor, Rebecca Long Bailey. And it was then that we realised that while the Labour membership, that Corbyn had always depended on for his authority and had always shielded him from attacks from within the Labour Party institution, that those people were not as left-wing as we thought they were, did not really have a very kind of clear sense of politics at all, and believed Keir Starmer just a byword for the establishment when he said he would continue with Jeremy Corbyn's policies. So that was the first sort of trauma, if you like, was recognizing that the socialist left is a lot smaller than you would have thought from the success of Jeremy Corbyn inside the Labour Party in Britain. And a lot of people who regarded themselves as socialists, regarded themselves as good, committed Corbynistas, nonetheless had been the gravediggers of a project that otherwise could have continued in a new form under Rebecca Long-Bailey. Instead, they brought in Keir Starmer, who has made it his business to crush the left and make sure that Corbynism or a similar project would never happen again. So that was the first kind of thing that, to my mind, was unreconciled. The second thing was the priorities that the remaining rump of the Corbynite left in Britain ended up taking on in the succeeding 18 months or whatever it's been. The fact that we could go from the incredible policy innovations, the incredible commitment to the downward redistribution of wealth and power, the astonishing resurgence of socialism in the Corbyn years that excited so many of us and inspired so many of us. We could go from that to the kind of thing that the main Corbyn, post-Corbyn platforms, the main left platforms, and others just to yours, were promoting, the kind of thing that the remaining socialist MPs around Corbyn were promoting, and the kind of thing that ordinary ex-Corbynistas seem to take as their priorities. All of those things seem to me so depressing and regressive that I ended up doing something I never thought I'd do, which is to write the hard lessons for the left article. In other people's politics, they sort of have a go at this genre as like the easiest thing to do, like the easiest thing to write is what the left's getting wrong. And I've complained about that in the past, but now the time has come for me to offer my my hard lessons, because I think that there are structural reasons for the mistakes that the radical left is currently making. I'm not talking about the Labour Party as a whole, like the Democrats. That's ultimately a right-wing regressive institution, one of the two cheeks of capital. I'm talking about the good guys here. I'm talking about the socialists who had a foot in the Labour Party for Corbyn, aren't really committed to it. I'm turning to them, my own people, and trying to address what it is I think they're getting wrong right now in the UK.
Well, the question I wanted to ask you gentlemen, James and David, is that one of the things that I find fascinating about the British situation with left entryism into the Labour Party is that it has a parallel in the United States with the rise of the Sanders phenomenon and the way in which electoralism and the belief in the capture of the Democratic Party by the putative or nominal left at that time was seen as an actual legitimate political strategy. I would like to inquire to either of you as our guests, do you think that perhaps part of the problem with the overall failure of Corbyn and maybe even Sanders was the belief that electoralism or entryism into the left bourgeois party as the first actual strategic move, as opposed to organizing a significant cadre or cadres, if you will, of organized, mobilized left adherents to a clear political agenda first, was perhaps the problem initially from the get-go as a strategy.
David, you knew the Democrats from the inside well before Bernie. Do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, so I was actually a county committee person following the sort of Dean campaign. I got involved in, there was a book by now centrist fraud, Marcos Melitsas. He wrote, it's called Crashing the Gates, and it was about how to take over the Democratic Party. And myself and Chris Bowers, who started one of the first progressive blogs called MyDD, that then ended up being, a million other sort of blogs. And, some of those people are on TV now. Chris is retired because he's tired of it. But he went on to start the New Organizing Institute, which did great work on organizing, creating sort of the popular movements that we want to change politics. I found that actually joining the local party in your county and your town, that actually helps a lot more than getting involved in sort of electoral politics more broadly. Because at these local elections, you have the opportunity to support, the local DSA candidate, or, at least get them in the room, those types of things. I think that type of entryism works. I think when you get into sort of the broader scale, I'm going to cheer for Team Blue stuff, I think that's where things go wrong. And I think that one of the problems, and I think this is a post-Obama problem, in many ways, younger people saw themselves get a seat at the table, at least during the campaign. Now, once he was elected, all the Obama people did not get positions of power. The Hillary Clinton people did. That was part of the deal, I think. But what you saw is people thought that, the presidency, these big top elections, that's our way to power. And I think this sort of, this is something that I think James would agree with in the Corbyn instance, is that this idea that we can top-down take over or top-down create sort of conditions of socialism, I think it's just not possible. But I do think that, just writing your name in on a county committee person list in a local election where no one else is running, we could go in and just give people shit for a while, at least once a month. I think that's not bad at all.
Yeah, I think that the British example is interesting, and I don't know. I start from the position that it wasn't all a mistake, and that we in Britain we could have won state power, and we did come very, very close. I also think that there was a path for Bernie to be the candidate and to be the president. I can't make predictions about what would have happened after that. Would it have been the Syriza situation all again? I don't know about that. But as far as entryism, if it was that, taking over the party, taking state power, all of those things, I think our projects demonstrated are possible, or at least they were possible under those circumstances. I don't buy into a kind of pessimism that says, well, it was electoralism that defeated us, well, bourgeois parties do be like that. I think that there was an opportunity, and the opportunity was squandered. I don't let us off the hook by saying, it was just circumstances beyond our control. There was the opportunity after the 2017 election for Corbyn to structurally transform the Labour Party. Instead, because of certain pathologies that I diagnosed in the article, there was not the will to tame the right of the Labour Party, to make it bend the knee, as I believe Chapo used to say, when the time was right. And therein lies our defeat and the fact that we are shut out of the process for the foreseeable future. So I agree with David that the grassroots stuff is obviously the only sustainable path, but I think that this kind of momentary top-down left populist experiment in taking over parties and seizing a kind of rare moment to get state power, whatever would have happened afterwards, that opportunity did exist and could have been done.
Now, I want to say, and I'm gonna piggyback on what you said. I think that is possible, but I would say that it works a lot better when you're in the local labor committees and things like that, where you can help define the rules that and help fight back against the initial friction that you're going to get. I mean, it's not going to be initial friction; it's constant friction. It's a rolling revolution. I think that one of those things that I think I'm not going to discredit the Bernie people, because I think they did great work, and I was very supportive of Bernie Sanders myself. I think that this idea that we can kind of outflank on sort of both try to take over the party, but also not do those sort of like basic building block stuff, you know, at the local level where you're winning over the hearts and minds of, you know, the older college professors who are on the committee and things like that. You know, I know it sounds like, you know, we're not like totally trying to embrace this PMC narrative or whatever, but I do think that, you know, there are those people who probably would have supported Bernie over Hillary had they had someone locally talking to them in that kind of way.
Yeah, the response to defeat of those experiments should be the patient work of filling in that void that Corbyn and Bernie had to operate on top of kind of refilling the fish tank, as it were. Is that happening? I don't think it's happening in Britain.
So, James, you've specifically said, and you've almost mentioned it there, that kind of your problem and what motivated this article was not exactly what's happened in 2019, though that's obviously a part of it, but what's happened subsequently. And one of the things that happened subsequently outside of the Labour Party, I'm not sure exactly what the dates are, but it feels like basically as soon as Corbyn was removed from the leadership, a plague descended on the whole world, which has then consumed us since then.
You do the math, you know.
So it's
correlation is not causation, but
so it's obviously we've been in exceptional times. Keir Starmer has basically governed the whole time as Labour leader within these exceptional times. But specifically, part of your critique is how the left has reacted to COVID, and especially, I guess, how Keir Starmer and that sort of people have reacted to it. So if you wanted to go more on that.
Yeah, sure. I guess the core of my argument is that after the defeat, actually literally 10 minutes after the exit poll came out that made it clear that Corbyn was going to be gone, that this was a humiliating defeat, that it would be very difficult for the left to come back from, instantaneously, everybody who had been who'd been kind of won over by the case for a second referendum on Brexit, everybody who had sort of drifted towards the cohort on the radical left that wanted to remain in the EU, all of those people suddenly, deleted their tweets effectively. Everybody forgot that they'd gone along with that Remain would drift, and everybody said, it was the second referendum policy. That's what killed us. Everybody learned their lesson instantaneously. What I claim is that they might have sort of learned the lesson on that specifically, even though, well, there are some question marks there. We're still thinking about the big issues that have come along since in exactly the same way that led us to the second referendum. And I can kind of get into the sort of thesis of this a little bit later, but I'm calling it, for shorthand, call it socialism from above. A kind of technocratic, anti-populist belief that the reason why the left should be in charge is that it's actually the left that knows best. That coded that turn to Remain, and I argue it's coded the basically two policies, two positions that the UK left has managed to concoct for itself since the defeat of Corbyn and the defeat of Rebecca Long Bailey and Sir Keir's leadership. And one of those is the response to COVID. I think unusually in Britain, it is the radical left who are the most hardline on COVID measures, most authoritarian on COVID measures. Zero COVID as an idea pretty much only exists in Britain on the post-Corbyn radical left. Actually, Keir Starmer has, we'll see how it works out for him. He has strategically declined to criticize the Tories and has more or less just kind of held a mirror up to whatever they're doing at any given time. Keir Starmer is not hardcore on lockdown. He's only as hardcore as Boris Johnson is. And, well, if you think lockdowns are inherently pretty hardcore, they are. But it is the radical left alone that is has offered kind of the maximal moral cover for COVID measures. And I argue that this is a supremely depressing situation, and it is not one that's rooted in the left having examined the evidence and decided that, they, ultimately this is the policy that's needed. It's based rather on some kind of complicated trauma response to their defeat, but also exactly the same impulses that led it to be vulnerable to supporting the second referendum policy. I mean, what would be some examples here? I accuse the left of having a sort of latent anti-populism. They did believe that the people who voted for Brexit ultimately were motivated by a disgusting sort of nationalism, racism, and so on. Similarly, I think there has been an assumption that people can't be trusted to act responsibly and decently while there's a pandemic, and therefore there has been an attraction to hardcore containment measures. The same sort of mistrust of the people, which is not unique to the left at all, but shouldn't be there on the left, has motivated that. That would be one kind of motive.
Which is obviously interesting because of how popular all lockdown policies are.
Yeah, exactly. Lockdown policies are hugely popular. People were very worried indeed, and more or less demanded lockdowns when Britain already had a pandemic containment policy, which involved admitting that it doesn't have the state infrastructure to do anything about it, and it would just have to let people die. That was decided in 2011 during the coalition government. It had a policy and was more or less kind of pushed into locking down by an international consensus that set in very, very rapidly, and became very popular among ordinary people. Even if you think of scenes where people were seen in the summer of 2020 on beaches, and the response was, "Oh my God, people are idiots! They're out there coughing on each other." Well, there were hardly any infections because you're standing on the coast and the wind is blowing and you're not really breathing on each other, and that proved to be fine. Other times when masks haven't been mandated, you still see people wearing masks in crowded areas. People have been sensible, and those people who continued to see their families clandestinely during lockdown, I overall think did the right thing. Whereas there was a sort of anxiety on the left and elsewhere that people couldn't be trusted because, well, they didn't vote for us, did they? Another kind of component of this is a sort of what I've called a hyper-partisanship on the part of the left. We like to think that in the UK and the US, the radical left is antagonistic to the party that it ends up stuck with. And in 2016, 2017, we were, and it was very effective. Clinton, Blairism, these are not popular things. And we managed to get a hearing because we said, yeah, we're the left and we're against that stuff too. However, it covered over a way in which ultimately nobody hates the Republicans more than the socialist left does. No one hates the Tory party more than the socialist left does in Britain. And this has been actually very dangerous to the point of being fatal because it has completely clouded the left's judgment. And it has led the left to think of Boris Johnson as this kind of genocidal maniac, as opposed to somebody who has been, not very effective, but rightly cautious about a kind of totally new policy space of lockdowns. So I could go on, but I think that in area after area, the left's support for maximal COVID measures, even though it claims that it doesn't want any of the authoritarianism necessary to implement them, has been motivated by the same kind of pathologies that led it to oppose Brexit as a Tory policy and to mistrust its voters.
One of the things that you allude to in your piece is something that I find very demonstrative in the coalition of the left that we have in the United States, was a problem we talk about oftentimes on our show, is that part of this kind of socialism from above ideology stems from the actual class makeup of what we call the left in perhaps in the UK, according to your article, or definitely in the United States, as basically being a constellation of downwardly mobile professional managerial class types who, even though they may not have the C-suite economic stability as the corporate lords that tend to support the neoliberal centrist politics of both the Democrats and Labor, they have some of the same kind of class sensibilities in terms of their distrust of working class voters, or the distrust in terms of their actual instincts on issues governing their well-being. I'd like to really hear your thoughts on how the actual class makeup of the left or labor overall becomes replicated in these support for these types of policies.
Yeah. Do you want to start off with an American response, David? Maybe not. Okay, I'll try for Britain then. Yeah, I mean, I do buy into that thesis that the possibility of the big socialist projects of the 2010s was precisely this moment where there was a dovetailing between a kind of downwardly mobile millennial professional class, people who had certain expectations raised for them in the 90s and early 2000s, which had been taken away by the financial crash. And they suddenly found themselves with the same kind of resentments and the same kind of lack of buy-in to neoliberalism that many of the so-called left behind of the kind of traditional constituency of the left had for a long time. And that was, okay, of course, a fragile coalition. I'm not somebody who thinks that was always damned to collapse or to not succeed, because it was possible to sustain it for as long as that sort of younger, more middle class kind of part of the left was self-critical about its own motives and recognized a need to compromise, and didn't think simply or straightforwardly that it spoke for socialism and that whatever its impulses were what socialism was. I mean, I sometimes joked that people on the left often think that nobody has any authoritarian or socially conservative views in the working class, because as soon as they do hold those views, they're no longer working class. You know, it's the Zizek joke about never fight with my girlfriends, because as soon as they fight with me, they're no longer my girlfriend. As soon as somebody has anything that it doesn't perfectly fit with the left's prospectus of social views that you have to sign up for, you're going to discover that they've got a boat dealership or something hiding out the back. We're very capable in the millennial professional class, such as I am in, of explaining away why certain kind of deplorable parts of the coalition aren't really working class after all. So as soon as that kind of drift set in or was allowed to predominate, and it supremely did with the drift towards the Remain position, where these people just didn't know enough people who supported Brexit and were allowed to kind of minimize them as minimize their electoral importance, and also to have all kinds of stereotyped ideas about their motivations. So yeah, I think that's certainly true. I think that it's perfectly possible to have a left that thrives with class traitors in its midst. I mean, Tony Benn was a hereditary aristocrat and one of the most important socialists we've had in the British 20th century. So again, it wasn't a foregone conclusion, but I think it's certainly the case that the kind of PMC thesis explains something of the Brexit drift, and I certainly think it explains the lockdown drift, that you're talking about people who had laptop jobs anyway, people with credit card debts that suddenly was getting paid off because you weren't having to commute anymore, people who were on the side of lockdown where you got stuff delivered to you, as opposed to being on the side of lockdown where you delivered stuff to people in increasingly alienated and dystopian conditions.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we often miss about how we arrive at some of our opinions. And I think there's two studies I just recently read that were quite interesting. And I don't want to be one of those evolutionary psychology guys. I'm not, that's not my politics. It's not sort of my way of thinking. But the two sort of interesting things that I read was that there were many of people's opinions are based upon not whether they think they're good or bad, but whether they're associated with people of high or low status. And I think that you could see that in a lot of the opinions that people have about a lot of things, whether that's lockdowns or any other policy, where if you see something as being like, that's something that people without sort of my pedigree or my sort of cultural awareness or, even like my artistic desires, we had interviewed this author called Rax King. And Rax King writes about culture, and she, writes about things like Guy Fieri and sort of tackiness. And in her book, she really expounded upon this idea that people don't want to be associated with things that are associated with low culture. And I see that playing out a lot in sort of people's opinions towards lockdowns, et cetera, what happens in schools, all these sorts of things. And then the second study that I read was about how people of higher education are less likely to understand that their opinions are shaped by their peers. And I think that's also interesting in the context of sort of Twitter and in the left on Twitter, is that a lot of our opinions aren't necessarily based upon our lived experiences or our sort of psychological processes or even our knowledge. I mean, I often see people who I think should know better about certain things often go along with the crowd. And, you saw that in instances like Me Too and in different places where, there was a lot of things, look at Alex Morris, he was chased out of society, but it was a few left influencers who thought it's just awful that this guy dates people, and he's in his 20s. You saw those sort of like bandwagoning, and I think that as a whole, and I think this the aspects of the left that find themselves in sort of a higher pedigree of education need to really look at is this my opinion or is this my friend's opinion? And I think that the more we discern what the differences between those two things are, I think we'll do better.
Yeah. I just want to also jump in here quickly. I think the other issue is if you have a narrow technical education on a particular topic, that's going to be shaping the way that you look at a specific public policy question. So if you're a medical doctor, it's entirely rational for you to, advocate, let's say, very harsh lockdowns, mandatory vaccines, these kind of things, because from, let's say, your rational scientific educational perspective, these would be the measures that would be most likely to exterminate the disease. But of course, we live in a society where we have to temper these things with politics. So, for example, if you say look, vaccination, let's put aside the suspicion about vaccination, but let's just say the vaccine works, mandatory vaccination would clearly be good if everybody got vaccinated. And that makes sense from a technocratic perspective, but from a political perspective, it can be counterproductive in that the imposition of the vaccine leads to a reaction where people resist. So if you have a particular technical training, even if what you advocate is perfectly rational from your technical perspective, it does not take into account the broader political implications of things. And that is one of the fundamental problems of technocratic leadership, is that we're going to leave it to the scientists, we're going to leave it to the bureaucrats who may have a perfectly rational and logical reason to adopt particular policies. But that does not mean that in an overall broader sense that those policies make sense, because they are only looking through a specific lens at a public policy question.
I think it may be even worse than that, Djene, because you've got a kind of a narrow cast of doctors supporting maximal lockdown measures because they're not seeing these things sociologically or economically or politically. But even beyond that, you've got a kind of a huge dereliction of duty, I think, on the part of all parts of the professional class. And in this respect, the radical left, which, as we know, is so dominated by professional class people, is just part of this map, you've got a situation where actually people who do have a kind of form of expertise or a form of background or commitment that should have led them to be much more critical of lockdowns and other containment measures, they went silent on that. So, I mean, examples would be, academics who specialize in malnutrition. They should have seen their role as being if we had a kind of functional bourgeois public sphere, you would have them saying, okay, but have you considered malnutrition? You would have the American Civil Liberties Union saying, have you considered the civil liberties dimension? Instead of just saying, no, vaccine mandates are fine. You would have had Foucauldian philosophers saying, oh, well, yeah, but have you considered that, expansions of healthcare measures have always coincided with a huge upward movement of power? Instead, you had academics saying, oh, well, actually, forget about Foucault and Agamben, they're just boomers. We don't need them anymore. And you had the radical left not paying attention to the fact that we were handing over huge unaccountable powers to governments, which in Britain, a government that we supposedly regard as far right, not paying attention to the fact that this has been a huge upward movement of wealth, not paying attention to the very kind of pharma companies that Jeremy Corbyn had held up, WikiLeaks style exposés of in the 2019 election, not caring about the fact that, one after another of areas that we supposedly stand up for and supposedly care about, we're getting just steamrolled by this single groupthink on COVID. So really, the radical left has been just one part of a whole kind of constellation across the public sphere where everybody has just got COVID think and seen everything through the lens of this one disease and has completely ignored the area of expertise that they're supposed to stand up for. This is not just a betrayal of socialism. This is a betrayal of bourgeois, liberal expertise. It's even worse than the professional class have taken over the left. COVID has taken over the professional class.
So this has basically traveled to the question I was going to ask anyway, but I'll ask it. There seems to be, to me, a phenomenon which you can see both in the US and the UK, where the left doesn't seem to know or doesn't seem to want to acknowledge who it is who enforces the laws they advocate for.
Yeah.
The really good example for this was the United States. It's a very minor thing, but I think it's very exemplary. There was a kind of anti-tobacco advocacy group who pushed for a law in a US city, which meant that in any place where smoking is banned, vaping would also be banned. And so they passed it after a few years of advocacy. And then a couple of weeks later, a policeman used this law, a group of policemen used this law to brutalize a young black man. And then this advocacy group posted on their Twitter like, oh, this isn't what we expected. We never asked for this, we didn't want to happen. But this is exactly what they'd asked for. And this seems to be something which was very clear in the British lockdown, when basically 1 week, various left figures were condemning the Rangers fans going out and celebrating them winning the Football League. And then a couple of weeks later, were absolutely furious that the police had intervened in a vigil for a woman who'd been murdered, which obviously to the radical left, these things seem completely contradictory. But to most people in the UK who don't particularly like protests, this kind of distinction isn't obvious. And it certainly isn't obvious to the state to which people had fought to give these powers to.
Yeah, well, that's why I go as far as to claim that the positions that the post-Corbyn left has taken since their defeat are not merely self-defeating, as they were over the second referendum, as many Corbynistas voting for Sir Keir, and as this is too boring to talk about on the show, but the other thing that the post-Corbyn left has got into, which is reforming the electoral system, the blood drains from the body, at the thought of trying to argue for that on people's doorsteps or in town centres. All of that stuff, it doesn't matter that much. It's just self-defeating and just makes the left irrelevant. It's sad. But what I'm really worried about is the way in which left in defeat has in the past and can end up supporting measures which seemed to chime with like its idea of what it would be doing if it was in power, but it's not in power, and its enemy is in power, and it is handing these these powers or these cultural changes over to its enemy in just the way you're describing, Stefan. So, I mean, the text that I think everybody must read is Nancy Fraser on second wave feminism and the cunning of history, where she sort of like admits to herself that it's not just that the New Left and second wave feminism, you know, failed somehow or were self-defeating, etc., etc. It's that in their defeat after 1968, they actually offered a vocabulary to neoliberalism, a set of frames of feeling, of arguments, of critiques. What had they said about the post-war consensus? That it was economistic, it only cared about raising material living standards for working class people, it didn't pay attention to other forms of oppression, it was androcentric, it paid a family wage to the assumed male worker, it was technocratic and statist, and it was very focused on the nation state. Well, okay, the New Left had its idea for how to change all those things and to bring about a kind of international socialism, but neoliberalism hated all those things as well. And it couldn't have won on its own. It needed that those left-wing energies and attitudes and the moral authority of the left in order to create not socialism, but an even more exploitative form of capitalism. That is what I would say to the post-Bernie and post-Corbyn lefts, that it's you don't just need to worry about whether you are getting in your own way or being self-defeating about whether you can ever get power again. The precedent of 68 is that the defeated left offers moral cover to a new, even more exploitative form of capitalism. So when people on the left today say, Bidenism, the new state kind of powers of lockdown, this is a kind of post-neoliberalism, I say, yeah, well, no shit. But the last time there was such a transformation in capitalism, it was to an even worse kind, and it did it with the moral cover of the left. And that is how I really see the significance of the left and lockdowns.
I think that one of the best examples of the phenomenon you're talking about, James, is the way in which the neoliberals or the centrist Democrats have appropriated concepts like anti-racism and identitarian politics in a way in which in the New Left era of the 60s was viewed as necessary and liberatory, but have, in the eyes of the contemporary neoliberal kind of corporate faction of these parties in labor and the Democrats of the United States, have appropriated the rhetoric and the illusion of this politics to pretty much push forth a very, very pro-corporate neoliberal agenda that is also rooted in crushing left materialist demands, which was something we saw in the 2016 and 2020 election, when you would see people like Hillary Clinton say things like, for example, fighting the banks is not going to stop racism, or as if the banks aren't one of the major sources of racialized expropriation of property from Black and brown communities. So literally, you see in that position her using anti-racism as a means to protect capital.
I would go even further. I mean, I completely agree with Pascal's point. I remember reading in the lead up to the American elections and the primary with Bernie, there was an article saying that the radical left is racist because the biggest option for the biggest source of non-white people work as lobbyists. So like if they're excluding lobbyists, it's actually a racist policy because Black people won't be able to work in the future Democratic Party administration. But I would go further. It's not only the liberals that appropriate this language, but also the right. Like the right wing has successfully appropriated a lot of the discourse that the left uses and turns it on its head. And we've seen this for a while. You go back to someone like Fidesz Schlafly, who's able to, talk about, women's empowerment to push a right-wing political agenda. You look at the way that anti-Semitism is mobilized, in a way to say, actually, it's the left that is fundamentally racist. You know, in a way, it shows that the left was morally victorious in the 1960s, and so much so that their political enemies are adopting the paradigms. So when we look at the critiques taking place, for example, against critical race theory in the United States, a debate which they seem to be attempting to shoehorn into the United Kingdom by hook or by crook, they're putting forward it's not that like this is necessary, you know, that it is anti-patriotic is only part of the message. The real message they try and push to discredit these things is that it's racism. It's, you know, it's not what Dr. King would have wanted. So we see all this anti-racism language, you know, inclusive, being inclusive. All these things are appropriated by all wings of politics, but you know, for very different political ends. And that's what happens when you have a politics of pure ideology, because you take away the material critiques that undergird these important discussions, then you can just play around with them and use them in any context you like. And you know, this is exactly what is happening with the discourse of the political right, which is throwing the accusations of racism and exclusion and elitism all back in the left's face, using its own vocabulary.
Yeah, I think that's 100% correct. And you know, I think it's most interesting, and I think to go back to COVID, one of the things that I think has been effective as a right-wing talking point is that the left has embraced, you know, things like mandates, and the left is, I'm using the left in like the broadest sense of the term, you know, anybody right left of the Attila the Hun, I'm going to say is the left in this instance. But you know, the people pushing for you know, sort of vaccine passports, et cetera, or mandates even, you know, especially like in the private sector, they're saying, you know, in New York City, the largest number of people who are unvaccinated are African American, and you know, there's historical reasons for that. And you know, we on the right, we get that. You know, we don't trust the state either. And you know, you're seeing that sort of messaging, and I don't know if it's playing with anyone, but I do know that it probably is playing with a few people. And I think that there's something about the way people talk about unvaccinated people. There's something a way they talk about all sorts of people that allows sort of to define, you know, further winnow down the left coalition, you know, excluding African Americans, excluding people who are, you know, sort of naturally a little bit, you know, they want to buck the system a little bit. You know, there's a lot of ways in which we're using this vaccinated, unvaccinated thing. And I'm vaccinated, you know, I have twin babies, like I'm absolutely vaccinated, but you know, there's this way that we are in grouping and out grouping and sort of creating like the world's smallest coalition of voters.
I think there's absolutely a lot of truth to that, and I think a lot of it has to do with this kind of virtue signaling being mistaken for politics that we get, in which there's this almost kind of knee-jerk reaction that if the right likes it, then anyone on the left must say, oh, this is ridiculous, this is insane, this is absurd, they're anti-science, or they're this or they're that. So what ends up happening is the phenomenon that James was talking about before, is that there's not an actual thought process on these respective policies, but simply because it's perceived to be advocated by your political adversary, then all of a sudden it becomes the mantle or the hill upon which you want to die on in opposition. And there's no real consideration in terms of asking as well, why is it that more working class people are not in favor of certain policies? Well, maybe it's because these policies adversely affect them in a way that someone who is, you know, working at home because they have that luxury doesn't really realize and doesn't understand and doesn't really see. And it's really fascinating. While I was witnessing this in New York with the anti-lockdown protests that you would see in New York City, the strangest coalition of people protesting. You would find kind of reactionary, right-wing nationalist types and Black Lives Matter activists all protesting against the mandates in New York City. And you're like, how is this happening?
And that's going to get bigger. Okay. I mean, something we've been trying to get ahead of on the Popular Show is our prediction that, like, when you start getting new authoritarian measures, which are more authoritarian than ever, actually. Look at the lockdowns exclusively for the unvaccinated in Europe. Look at vaccine mandates for the private sector in New York, first of their kind. You get the first time in England, the vaccine mandates have been contemplated, the Tories having kept them out thus far. The risk is getting lower. More people are vaccinated than ever, but the measures are getting more draconian. What you're going to see is people who absolutely went along with all of the measures thus far, people who, like David were describing, did not identify at all with the deplorables and undesirables who dissented on these things. You're going to get them thinking, like, I'm kind of boosted out, or I'm not locking down again. I think you're going to see that kind of coalition really start to grow. It's already much more diverse than is reported on. And the left, if it wants a future other than just being a kind of, moral cover, as we described, for whatever authoritarian measures come along, if it wants a future as a political coalition, then it needs to have some narrative to sell those people. It has to have some way of, like, showing that it is capable of representing those people, because thus far all it has ever done is complain about the Tories not being harsh enough, and demand unlimited authoritarianism in measures. We're starting to see a bit of cover breaking actually on the UK left just in the last 24 hours since Boris Johnson announced these new measures, just totally flagrantly to distract from the reports that he himself had broken them by having a Christmas party last year. That's been too much for even our very pro-lockdown left spokespeople to stomach in Britain. So maybe there is some adjustment going on. But yeah, that's kind of something we've been working on, really, is that, like, you are the lockdown policies, the mandate policies are going to start testing people's patience in a pretty big way. And thus far, the left has had nothing to offer those people, not even free speech on the subject.
It's interesting to see the transition from Trump to Biden and sort of the discussions about COVID and how it's creating sort of like cognitive dissonance in sort of like the liberal sector of the Democratic electorate. I think you're seeing people, COVID it's as bad, I guess, as far as cases go in the States, but you're seeing people sort of say, you know what, it's fine now because daddy's in charge, and you saw a lot of people who are calling for, Trump's not doing enough. And they're like, actually Biden, if you could, ease up a little bit, I'd like to go to the mall, or, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're seeing sort of that cognitive dissonance come to play. I think that's it's hypocrisy is very frustrating, but I think it's overrated as a political force. And I think that, we have to really, rather than saying, well, you were saying this 6 months ago, I mean, of course that's true. But we also have to say, like, okay, what do we actually want when we do have some nominal voice in the government? Like, I don't think that the left is in charge with Biden. I'm not one of those people. But how do we use that to make sure that these policies are not just, a continuation of sort of the reactionary policies of the first, let's call it year one.
And I would also jump in there and say, I think, even at the, when at the beginning of the pandemic, when people didn't, know what was happening or how deadly the disease is, having a lockdown or something for a temporary period would perhaps make sense. But once we got past that initial phase, the reality was that, life would have to go on. And the choice becomes, you ignore it and maybe it'll spread, or you spend the resources required to help people to mitigate these things, like having, in the United States, having better healthcare, perhaps helping companies, create, better protocols to deal, to protect people and things. But those things are expensive, right? Those things are huge government investments, right? So to deal with a pandemic, you would need enormous mobilization of resources. And I don't think the neoliberal state had that ability. nor did it have the political will. So all it can do is the short-term emergency measure, but forever and forever and ever. So rather than creating the structural things that you need in order to, in order to help mitigate a crisis, they just go with these emergency measures all the time. And I think this issue is going to return as climate crises pick up in space, in intensity over time. We'll see, rather than attempts to deal with structural issues, readjust our way of life, provide resources to people so that they can sort of mitigate the worst effects of these crises. We'll just see the mobilization and utilization of emergency measures over and over again, because when we do have these crises, rather than dealing with them root and branch and spending the resources required to deal with them, the neoliberal state merely wants to get people to do, basically force people to behave in a particular way on the cheap, and then bail out its friends.
Did you see the Biden spokeswoman said it was like impossible for the United States to send test
exactly
packs?
What I was thinking about.
Everyone? Yeah, and I've got this here, which you can get absolutely trivially in the UK with 8 tests in it, and you can get one of these every week. You can test yourself every day in the UK for free.
Yeah. I mean that kind of ominous way in which both how states have responded to COVID and how the left has responded to that response, deeply ominous as far as the management of climate change goes. It seems to me that it's going to be a classic example of that cunning of history argument. Already, Boris Johnson is talking about a green industrial revolution, borrowing straightforwardly the language of Corbynism, our version of the Green New Deal. Now, what is that going to be? Is it going to be what we asked for, a democratization of the economy, where you make the economy green while also radically improving people's quality of life and the amount of autonomy they have over their work? Of course not. It's going to be a kind of aesthetics borrowed from the left and from environmentalists and from Corbynism applied to more authoritarianism. And will the left critique it and attack it on those grounds? The evidence of the COVID ordeal is that that's not what they'll do. We could have spent lockdown, and if we'd had more forums for free speech and debate about it, we might have reached this realization. We could have spent lockdown with the left campaigning that healthy people who are not at risk should remain on furlough, but should be out there building the health infrastructure that was so sorely lacking. That should have been the left-wing position, that you treat it like a war economy with a kind of conscription, and we rebuild the structures and the infrastructure that neoliberalism has hollowed out. Instead, the left was arguing for interminable passive lockdowns where everyone's just locked up watching Tiger King, and had no kind of idea of even presenting an alternative narrative for what we as a state could be doing. And I just see the same thing happening with climate change. That there's going to be compliance. There's not going to be an alternative policy put forward and campaigned for.
Well, I definitely agree with you in that that regard. And the question I have that we wanted to get into early on is the United States going the way of Great Britain and becoming a one-party right-wing state down the line because of the functional inability of our Liberal Party to deal with the crisis of the moment, and the messaging the messaging of the right ending up basically giving them all of the space to occupy political victories that on actual practical levels should have gone to the liberals or the left. So it's a strange position that we are in the United States, because it does seem like the political momentum is with the reactionary right, and that actually may be a possibility down the line.
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy, if you do see it that way, was that right-wing populism successfully took over the parties of the right, while the parties of the left committed all of their energy and all of their political capital and all of their remaining status to crushing left populism inside them. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what a successful Democratic Party would look like now, but yeah, without the moral blackmail of Trump and COVID, which is what led to scraping the 2020 election, and with all of that kind of moral capital of both Black Lives Matter and the idea that Biden was going to incorporate something of Bernie's program, all of that squandered. Yeah, I can see a situation where you're heading on the same kind of trajectory that Britain's on, where liberals committed all of their energies to crushing the radical left while it was still radical, and now there's nothing. Now there is no alternative left.
Absolutely.
Well, that is a gloomy point for us to come to an end. David, do you have a last word?
I just want to say that we will see in the midterm elections, and like not to be too electoralist about this, but I think that the squandered energy of, Build Back Better and, pushing out some of the more popular policies and including things like the salt caps, removing the salt caps and things like that. I think you're going to see that that lost energy is going to come through in a year where the Democrats are already disadvantaged because of retirements and sort of the redistricting that's going on after the 2020 census. What we'll see is the Democratic Party become weaker. Now, what they do with that, who knows? And I think that the answer typically for the Democrats is always, we need more of we just went far left. And I think they're missing an opportunity.
Well, I would like to thank everybody today. I'd like to thank Pascal and Stefan for being here for this lovely pre-record. And I would like to thank our lovely This Is Revolution guests, James and David. I hope we can have you back on again in the future. It was wonderful to finally have you guys on. David and I go back way back, but I have listened to the Popular Show, and of course I know your mutual friend Alfie, who I believe is at your same institution. So yeah, I am definitely hope we can continue this conversation again in the future, and we can talk about some of these extremely important issues. And thank you so much for the wonderful work that you're doing. And with that, as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.